Welcome to the Cedars, and welcome to the First Friday Lecture Series. I want to thank the college. This is a great partnership, I think, between the college and the Cedars to bring these in here and keep you folks educated and all of us educated and well learned and stuff. So with that, I'll let Steve Gustafson introduce the program.
Before I introduce Shane Kirchner, I want to be sure and remind you that next month's First Friday will feature Kyle Hopkins. It's certainly my privilege to introduce my colleague Shane Kirchner this afternoon. And I really feel old when I start introducing people that were students when I was teaching at McPherson. I'm sure most of you know Shane. He's a McPherson College alumnus, has graduate work from Wichita State University and earned his doctorate from Kansas State University. He taught in the public schools of McPherson, has a background in Spanish, lived in Barcelona, and we're thrilled that he is currently serving as chair of the teacher education program at McPherson College. So it seems very appropriate that he talk with us this afternoon on the topic of the brain and education. Dr. Kirchner.
All right, thank you very much. I simply pulled one of the lessons that I teach in my Principles and Strategies of Teaching class, which is our basic how to write a lesson plan, how to actually teach. It's not the first class in our series of education classes. Our very first class is Intro to Ed, but that's a bunch of boring history of education and blah, 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 philosophy stuff. So we jump straight to the how to do stuff. So today's topic, as it says here, is the brain and education. So we're going to go back and look at what is the biology of the brain? How is the brain structured and formed? And how can we as teachers use the brain and how it functions biologically to make learning more efficient and those kinds of things? So we'll jump right in here. I've got to get my tools set up.
Would you like to know how many people are teachers that are in here that have gone through?
Oh gosh, yeah, that'd be how many are teachers of some I should guess how many aren't teachers would maybe be the easier question. There'd be about 5 or 6, I think. So, all right. So we first need to jump in here, and this is kind of a college version, so it's got a few of these. To keep the college students excited about things, we put some of their stuff. So that's Homer Simpson if you don't recognize the profile. So some key parts of the brain. I usually start by saying, if you're to take your two fists, make fists, and then you take your thumbs and you cross them over and put your fists together. That's about how big your brain is when it's inside your skull. So you can see it's got some padding around that as well. It's also a good representation because we know the brain is made up of 2 hemispheres. So you can kind of see the 2 hemispheres. And it's got grooves in it. And so your fingers, knuckles represent some of those grooves. And then it crosses over. And we generally suggest that the right side of the brain works on the left side of the body, the left side of the brain on the right side of the body is the general rule that's there. Then within the brain, we have some other main parts that stick out. So it's always a fun word, the hippocampus, kind of like a large water mammal walking across the college. It's kind of found right in the center of the brain. It's the crossover, it's the connection section between the left and right hemisphere of the brain. And we also know that it does a lot with I was reading an article just yesterday or so. I have a student who's writing a research paper in a senior level class called Looking at Child Abuse and Reading Ability. And how does child abuse affect reading ability? And one of the things that we found out in that article was that we know students who were abused have lower hippocampus density. So when you look at the brain of an abused child, it just isn't as big, it isn't as well developed. And if that's the connector between left brain and right brain, and we know that left brain is logic and language, and the right brain tends to be the creative side of the brain, the artistic side, we need both of those parts to blend together to help someone become a reader. And if we have low density due to sexual abuse or physical abuse as a child, then that part of the brain biologically cannot function as well, which doesn't make those connections as quick, which therefore means this person is going to be a slow reader, and it's biologically based in addition to emotional based and everything else. The thalamus is just a part that works as a relay station that gets into that. The cerebellum is in the back of the brain, and it's the thing that you don't have to sit at your table and think, oh, I forgot to breathe. I'm going to die here in a minute because I forgot to breathe. Parts of your brain just do that automatically. It helps. It's a little more efficient in life if part of your brain does that for you. The cerebrum then is the big part of the brain in the front that really does the thinking for us and the mental processing. And then one of my favorite parts is the amygdala, a Greek word that really kind of means almond-shaped, and it's found here in the kind of the front center. If you're like poke right through and right through, you'd come to the amygdala in your brain. It's a little almond-shaped part of the brain. And one of my favorite things is if you were to rewrite that instead of amygdala, think of it as a name. This is my best friend, Amy G. Dalla. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm Amy G. Dalla. And she's like, oh, because that's the emotional control. And you know how Amy is. She's just super excited about everything. Or like one day she's really happy and excited. Now I'm so depressed, my boyfriend left me. And so the amygdala is that part of the brain that really controls the emotion. But if we take that part of the brain and think about education, if you have a kid who says, math test, oh, I get to take a math test. Yay, that will be fun. Or they say, oh, a math test, I'm bad at math. I have math anxiety. I have test anxiety. It's the amygdala that is controlling that. And so what happens is we have various senses, sight, sound, ears, touch, and when things come into our brain through our 5 senses, and they hit the thalamus, and the thalamus has to decide, is this good as a relay station if I see something? So imagine you're walking down a trail. You're holding the hand of your love, walking down the trail, in the woods, enjoying a lovely afternoon, and you see something out of the corner of your eye that's about that long, about that big around, and it's brown, amongst the trees. Your senses have just turned on, and now your thalamus has to decide very quickly, in an instant, shall I jump and run from a snake, or shall I step over a twig? And so the thalamus has to make that quick of a decision to decide, snake, or, oh, stick. And then that runs to the amygdala, which then says, oh, I'm going to freak out and be angry about this. I'm going to be upset about this. And all this time, you haven't even got anything to the prefrontal cortex, the cerebrum, which is going to make a logical decision, because all these other parts of the brain are doing all of that in a half a second before you can do anything else. So the biology of the brain becomes really critical to what we're going to start teaching and how we're going to teach it. So let's look at some other parts of the brain as well. More research has started coming around, partially through strokes. When someone has a stroke and part of their brain is killed, certain skills are lost. One class I took on brain research says neuroscientists really like motorcycle riders also. Because you wipe out on your motorcycle, you crack your skull open, and they can quickly identify, ooh, what can you not do today that you used to do yesterday? So we know things like right here, speech is stored right there in your brain. We know that coordinating movements happen back here, posture and balance in the back. We know the visual cortex of the brain goes to the very back of the brain. And so we just know those things. So if think of our son who plays sports. If he lands on the basketball court and hits the back of his head, and you can't see for a moment because you've damaged that part of your brain, which is the back of your brain where the vision happens. So we know language. So we're starting to learn where different parts of the brain are stored. And then, of course, we know that you can have a lobotomy, remove part of the brain. We can reteach those skills, and they're stored in other parts of the brain. So the brain is very fluid and plastic. It can move and adapt however it needs to. I'm going to skip that part. The brain is then made up of all of these little tiny cells called neurons. And I say little, but not all of them are so little. The general body of the cell is here. And then there's always one long branch that sticks off the cell, and that's called an axon. And we've determined some axons, the nucleus of the cell is located here, and some of those axons run all the way down to the middle of your back. They can be that long for one cell. So what happens whenever you're having a thought is you're sending electrons shooting down this axon. So a little shot of electricity runs down this big axon, and it gets to a dendrite, which is on the next cell. And when it gets to that, this electrical pulse shoots down, and then when it gets to the end, it doesn't send the electricity across, but it sends chemical reaction to that next cell. And so that's what a thought is. And that tells those neurons fire and says, ouch, stove is hot, I should move my hand off of the stove. But when you're having all that thought, move hand quickly, it's really all of this electricity flowing through your brain, down the axon, making the muscle contract, which moves the hand out of the way. And then what I think is neat is this little gap called a synapse where these chemicals jump back and forth. And that's where you've heard chemicals like dopamine and all these other, if you take an antidepressant drug, you drink too much caffeine and you get hyperactive. A lot of that is different chemicals flooding these spaces between the cells of the brain. And that's what controls, if you have anxiety, so you take an anti-anxiety medication because you have too much of one chemical, you can balance it out with a different chemical there, and it's happening at that space between those different neuron cells when they're touching each other or almost touching each other and controlling that electricity. So again, just fascinating stuff how all those little thoughts process through there. We also have learned in brain research that whenever you have this electrical pulse that shoots down this long axon, a myelin sheath forms around that axon, and that's a form of a fatty substance that grows. And as you shoot this impulse down, you get a little bit more. You shoot that thought again. It's like if someone asks, "What's your telephone number?" "Hey, what's your name?" That's not a memory you have to think too long about. Just a second. I know this one. Shane, that's my name. See, we don't have to think about that because we've had that thought so many times that axon has so much myelin sheath around it that electron just flows down really quickly. And so when you think about rote memory, go memorize this. You have that memory 10, 12, 15 times in a row. You've now memorized something. Biologically, what's happened is we've taken this axon and we've coated it with a myelin sheath to make it so those electrons flow so much more quickly because we've practiced that memory so many times that it just flows and it's easy to remember things. So there is some benefit to doing rote memory in spelling words and those kinds of things when we're doing that. Because and this is kind of the phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together. There's almost like hardwiring your brain on certain things that you can do. So next time someone calls you a fathead, say thank you. You're complimenting my brilliant memory and all the myelin sheath. I've got lots of fatty substance in my brain, so thank you for calling me a fathead. It's a plus. There's another part of the brain. Go back here one more. The neurons are all in your brain, and they do all the thinking. But something has to hold the neurons together, and there's another set of cells called glial cells. And no one really knows exactly what glial cells do other than hold the neurons in place. But some research was done. In fact, they had a chunk of Einstein's brain at KU for a while. And when they analyzed his brain under the microscope, they determined that he had about twice the density of glial cells than the average brain did. Still not sure what it does. It doesn't necessarily work in the thought process, but it's part of the brain. And again, in Einstein's, it was denser than most. So interesting how that goes.
Maybe he was born that way.
Could have been. Could have been. So, yeah, it's hard to say. We'd have to do a lot of experiments, and anyone willing to donate? I'm not ready yet. We also know that the brain has a certain wavelength. The brain is always pulsing. It kind of goes back to that idea that the opera singer sings loud enough they can take the glass and they'll shatter the glass because it's pulsing. Everything has a wave everything has a natural tone to it. And if you know anything about music, and it has its sound waves, well, the brain has its waves that it pulses at, but it switches. And so right now, I'm guessing, I can tell by looking at all of you in the room, I think you are all at the beta wave. It's the fastest wavelength that the brain moves at, and it's the wave where you're awake, you're alert, you're multitasking, you're listening to me, you're drinking your coffee, you're thinking about your cookie, you're doing all that at the same time. You're in beta state, and that's the normal functioning state that everyone's at when they're awake. Now, alpha is the ideal state for learning. Alpha state is that time that, think of the last time you were reading that book you really wanted to read, because you wanted to and you didn't have to. That's a phrase I throw in for my college students. It's a book you wanted to read. And you looked up and said, oh my goodness, is it 5 o'clock already? I can't believe I've been reading this book for 3 hours. The last time you were in that state where time passed and you had no idea that much time had passed because you were so into whatever you were doing, that's when you were in alpha state. So we all go there from time to time. So I think as an educator, imagine if we could force our students into alpha brain state. They'd be like, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. And they're like, that would be awesome. Unfortunately, we're not there. Then we have the two other stages of theta and delta. Theta state is that dream state where your brain is really active. You're processing your day, but you're essentially asleep. And it's not deep sleep, but you're there. Your brain is unwinding. So it's going through all of this. And then delta is, of course, that deep sleep. And most research is now saying you need 4 solid hours of delta sleep to clear out your brain from the day. And it goes back to that part called the hippocampus, and we talked about the density of that. But 4 hours of deep sleep has been shown to clean out and process all the information from the day and move that knowledge from short-term and working memory into long-term memory. So it's really critical to have those 4 hours of deep sleep every night to clear that out. And then, of course, I'm talking to college students who like to stay up till midnight, 1, 2, 3 in the morning, and then they get up for 8 o'clock classes sometimes, and then they're on for the rest of their day, and their sleep cycle is messed up. Well, I just sleep like 2 hours. I take a 2-hour nap in the morning. I take a 2-hour nap in the afternoon. I take a 2-hour in the evening, a 2-hour in the middle of the night, and that's my cycle. I get 8 hours a day every day, but it's in 2-hour chunks. Biology would prove that that's not enough for good cleaning out of your brain. So it's quiz time. Sorry, it's a class. Turn to a neighbor right near you and discuss 2 things you learned about the brain. Take a moment. Go. Thank you for sharing with each other. Thank you. That's another very intentional moment because we know that by reviewing, we're building those axons. We're putting a myelin sheath around that information because I shared it with you. You've now been forced to own some of that knowledge by sharing it with someone else that you know. So you're now a fat head. Congratulations. So that was all good. Okay. Let's make memories. And that's not just a good pickup line. Again, for my college students, they like the humor, and hey, I can get a date here with a let's make memories together. So how does a memory work? In this model, and this model comes from a gentleman who wrote this book called David Sousa, How the Brain Learns. This is his model that's in this book, and there's a couple of other similar models, but in order for you to make a memory that you're going to keep for a long time or a short time, oh, I just thought of something. If you can help me with this in just a moment. Ann and I are busy tonight. She's in the back if you didn't know. My wife Ann is here. We're going to need to order pizza for supper, and that's from Pizza Hut. The number is 241-7200. If you could help me remember that later, I'll appreciate that. Anyway, back to this. If we're going to make a memory, we have to get that information into our system and into our brain so we can have it for later retrieval. Generally, we put stuff in through our 5 senses. Sight, sound, touch, taste, and hearing. Now, we don't use all of those in education so much. We tend to use these 3, which we call VAC: visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. In school, we do things by seeing it, by hearing about it, and by touching and doing and reading and those kinds of things. So, now, there's other ones like the sense of smell, and I keep telling my students, wouldn't it be great if we could monopolize the sense of smell for education? And I always say this one. Do you remember the stuff they sprinkle on the ground when someone throws up in elementary school? Remember that smell? But don't all you have a beautiful memory, not even necessarily a beautiful memory, but don't you have a vivid memory of something right now? Now imagine if we could do that with a Pythagorean theorem. Mint. Whenever I smell mint, I think of Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. If we could monopolize sense into memories, wouldn't that be brilliant for education? Just sprinkle smells around your classroom and your kids are instantly doing stuff because that's what you want them to do. Anyway, we have to put stuff into our brain somehow. If it's going to get into our brain, it has to first pass through the perceptual register. So perceptual is perception. How do you feel about it? So imagine the perceptual register like the Venetian blinds on your house. And if the sun's out and you open the blind and you can see right through it and it's just fine. But if you close the blinds, all those little gates close and you can't get through. And that memory will not come in. So if you have a person who has math anxiety and say, hey, boys and girls, we're going to study math. They close their shutters. They're not going to let that thought in. Whatever you say, hey, we're going to fix a car. I hate cars. They just get me from point A to point B and they cost a lot of money. Other people would say, oh, we're going to fix a car. Yay, I love fixing cars. That sounds like great fun. So we have to, if we're going to get anything into the brain, we have to first open our perceptual register and let it come in. So that's the first hurdle. If we can't open the perceptual register, that memory is going to fall out, and we're not going to be able to keep it. If we get it there, then we can have it in short-term memory. And this is like a picture of a clipboard. A clipboard can hold, 10, 12, 15 pieces of paper, and that's it, and then it's gone. If you don't use it within like 30 seconds to a minute, that information is gone. Let's do a test. My wife and I have to buy pizza later this evening. Can you please tell me the phone number for Pizza Hut? I told it to you just a minute ago. Oh, you've moved way past short-term memory, and you're all the way into working memory. Very good. All right, working memory is a larger set of, see, it's a card table. It can hold a lot more information. You can put lots of clipboards on a card table. Again, if we don't use this information, we will drop out and it will not stay with us for a long time. Now, if we're going to take any of that memory that we're making and going to put into long-term storage that we intend to keep for a very, very long time, and those are represented by filing cabinets there on the end, lots and lots of storage. It needs to get to long term, we take our working memory and we have to associate it with something that's already there, and we pull that in, we push that out, and we make this loop between what we already know and what we're learning, and we connect those things together. And it works best if the stuff that we're learning, if the new stuff coming in makes sense to us and it's meaningful to us, we have much higher retention. And that should make sense. If it makes sense, I get it. I know what you're talking about. I understand. That makes sense. But it could be meaningless. It's like, yeah, I understand that if I want to figure out the long side of a triangle, I need to know that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. But when am I ever going to use that? That's like my daughter in math right now. When am I ever going to use any of this stuff? So it all makes sense to her. I know why we're doing it, but I don't know when I'm ever going to use this. It makes sense, but it's not meaningful in her life. So it just isn't important. Or if there's stuff that's meaningful in your life, I have to do this, I hate doing this, I don't want to do this, it doesn't make sense, I don't understand it, but the teacher told me to memorize it, so I memorized it. I don't know what it means, but it makes sense to me. Again, the retention, the long-term retention of that information tends to be lower because it's not, if it makes sense and is meaningful, retention is going to be much higher. Okay? And so that allows us to then put it into long-term. And again, we also know that if we're taking all new information and we're going to attach it to old information, that becomes a really critical spot that I always try to teach students all the time. How are you, and we use a fancy phrase, how are you activating their schema? Schema being all the background information you have in your brain. So I start almost every class that I teach now with a simple story, and every story starts the same exact way. So my dog and I were out walking, or I was out jogging my dog. And everyone believes that story because they know I have a dog, and I also go jogging with my dog most every morning. Some of you have maybe even seen me jogging with my dog. And so I start every story with, so I was out with my dog this morning, and the most bizarre thing happened. We were going around lakes. You know where Lakeside Park is, don't you? And there's like water that goes through Lakeside Park, except for when it's frozen, it's not water, then it's ice. And so Champ and I were out jogging with the dog, and we were going by. And as we were looking by, I'm like, the sun is just coming up, and all of a sudden there's this bright light coming off the lake, and I'm wondering, what is this bright light coming off the lake? And see, I've got all your attention right now because it's a goofy story. I could go on and tell you there's a story about the ducks, because I saw ducks on the lake with my dog. But the funniest thing happened. That bright light was coming from the ducks, and I looked twice, and I looked again, and I looked a third time. When I looked over there, I saw the ducks were wearing braces. The ducks had braces. It was the strangest thing to have light shining off of these ducks' mouths because they were all wearing braces. And I said to my dog, "Dog, this is weird. These ducks are wearing braces. Let's go home. This is too weird." So we continue along the lake, and we're jogging again. And we get to the next spot, and I look over, and the strangest thing is there's this big yellow raft out there in the middle of the lake, and on top of the raft there were two pelicans. It's like, this is odd. Most pelicans know how to swim. I wonder why they're on a raft. So I say to my dog, "Dog, first we saw these ducks with braces on their teeth, and then we saw two pelicans on a raft. This is an odd, odd day." I said, "Champ, we need to go home. Let's go home." So we're jogging back home, and as we're jogging home, have you ever seen the red fox that lives around? I saw the red fox the other day. The strangest thing happened, though. There were two of them, not just one. But the funny part was there was a man wearing a sweatsuit, a green sweatsuit, and he had the fox on a leash. The strangest thing, this funny man holding a leash with 2 foxes on the end of it, just the strangest thing I've ever seen. Champ, this is the weirdest day I've ever seen. First we saw, oh, thank you, braces, thank you, the ducks with braces were there. And I said, this is strange. And then the next thing we saw was, oh, thank you, a couple of pelicans on a, thank you, a raft. And then as we were heading home, we saw those 2 foxes and the guy in the green jumpsuit with the leash with the foxes, that's right. So I said, let's go home. And I got home and I say, I'm going back to bed and starting this day over. This is odd. So I get home and I open up the covers to my bed and it was filled with clams. So I can't even go back to bed and start my day over because I've opened my bed and it's filled with clams. This is ridiculous. Do you know what you've just learned? I just took you through a narrative chain. I told you a story which made a visual image in your brain because the brain likes to have visual images. And do you know what we call a group of ducks? We don't call them a flock of ducks. We call them a brace. A group of ducks is called a brace. Any guess what a group of pelicans is called? It's called a raft of pelicans. Do you know what you call a group of foxes when you see a group of foxes? A leash of foxes. You know what you call a group of clams? You call them a bed of clams. A bed of clams. And I intentionally did a number of things. I stood right here when I talked about the brace of ducks, and I did this movement. I stood here in a different location, and I did this with my arms talking about a raft. I made a visual image for you to focus on to help your brain remember that. I included the word yellow with the raft. Over here I talked about a man with a green sweatsuit with a leash, and I held my hand out like this, talking about a pair of foxes. And I moved over here and I did this gesture, which means a bed, because I threw over the covers of my bed. So there was a physical movement, there was a particular location in the room, and you learned all that vocabulary right there. Boom, I tricked you into learning again. Now back to this story, which is probably not near as exciting as the story about the dog. But what I really, really like about this is your cognitive belief system. What you think and believe about life is your collective set of memories. Everything you already know makes you know what you believe, and you believe what you know because of your memories. So all of those good memories and bad memories make up who you are, which I think is really cool because that becomes your perceptual register. If you've had bad experiences about this, next time someone says this, then you're not going to want to do that. You're going to close your perceptual register. So all of your combined memories that you let in form who you are, and that forms what you're going to let in. So it's either a great cycle or it's a vicious cycle. And so I think as teachers, then we need to figure out how do we make this a happy cycle? How do we make this a good thing? And I think that's a really fascinating way to look at how we make memories in our brain. So quiz time. Recap. Talk about how do we make a memory? How does that fit? Take a moment and talk amongst yourselves. Recap. Own some of that knowledge. All right. Thank you for sharing with each other. I've got a question in the back. I hope I can answer it.
Well, if you know you're afraid of math or something, can you purposely open your perceptual register?
Have you been in a situation where you've been able to open your perceptual register? Yeah, I think we can. The question was, if you've closed off your perceptual register for whatever reason, what does it take to reopen that? And so what does that, whatever that circumstance might be, and oftentimes what helps us open our perceptual register, who are the other people with you? You know, a lot of someone you hang out with will help you through that situation. So, you know, you put yourself in a situation, you know, whatever the bad situation, or you're like, I'm afraid of snakes. Well, through enough time and patience with the right kinds of snakes, the right people that you trust, if you're with people that you trust who lead you into that situation, I think you can open those things.
I think sometimes a different teacher. I remember when I had trouble with math in about 5th grade and we got a new teacher. And when I finished 6th grade, I was at the top of the class in the math thing. I mean, all I can explain is a teacher.
Yeah, I would agree. Rebecca wanted to make a comment also about some observations she's made.
Speaking about memories, I want to say something about Dayton because this is unbelievable to me. His dementia started 5 years ago this month and gradually made its way. But when he went to therapy one time at the Cedars, they wanted his social security number, and I got my purse out and started looking, and he gave it to them. And so then I did crossword puzzles, and I did stuff, and he was history major in undergraduate work. And every history question I asked him, he'd give me the answer for the crossword puzzle, clear up until the last week. And if it was athletics and I wanted to know a certain player in some field, and I'd say, I've got this many letters, and I said, I don't know who this is, and he'd give me the answer. And now how, when there are so many things that are gone,
Yeah.
That's so amazing.
And that's a whole new branch of neuropsychology that I just haven't studied any of it. I don't know anything about those realms, but yeah, it is. And again, just the brain and how flexible it is, how much it can do, it can redo, it can relearn. It's just an amazing tool. Another amazing thing I think that some research has shown that the brain consumes 20% of all the calories that we do in our whole body. You know, 20%, I mean, this much of your body uses 20% of all the energy in your entire body. You know, that's just amazing. And it just Okay, you should find, I have to do this because I said I would do this. Here's what I do in my class. You will find scratch paper. They're located on your table. If you don't have one, there you go. Now, I do that intentionally to my students because we also know if you've been sitting for a while, to get this thing going and using 20% of your energy, you need to get your bodies going. These muscles right here are the biggest set of muscles on your body. So that simple act of, let me get some paper off the floor, increases your heart rate, gets your blood flowing again, and which goes directly up into your brain as well. So you'll all need a scratch paper if you don't have one, because we have a test coming up. Do you have something to write with? You'll need something to write with. There are crayons and markers on your table. Okay, here's how our quiz is going to work. I'm going to show you something on the screen in just a moment. I'm going to give you 12 to 15 seconds to look at it, and then you can write down what you see on the screen. What you see, do not write until I tell you you can write. Just look at the screen and watch. Are you ready? Okay. I didn't give you good wait time there. I apologize. Look. Right. Please check your work. All right. Okay, now that you know how to play the game, we're going to play the same game one more time. I'm going to show you some numbers on the screen, and then I want you to look at them for a moment, and then you can write them down. So don't write when you see them, write after you've had a chance to memorize. Here we go. I don't have it memorized. I just write the test. I don't take it. Check your work, please. I was just refreshing on some of the brainwave stuff. And, you know, we talked earlier about, the question up here is, can you train yourself to forget bad things and things like that? I was doing some last-minute research and just reviewing some stuff. When we talk about those 4 brain waves, the theta, delta, alpha, and beta, and one of the things I just saw is they've recently identified using EEG machines, check the brain waves while and they give you stuff to do, They've identified a new one called the gamma, which is below delta, so it's even slower than the delta. And there are certain people, according to the mysticism websites I was looking at, that when you get in transcendental states, when you have the life after death experience, your brain is most likely in the gamma wavelength, where your body is dead, but your brain is not quite. And so some of those afterlife experiences may be part of that. So if you start getting into that deep of it, can you train yourself to forget? And they talk about deep meditation, and you think of Karate Kid, like, I'm going to pretend I'm dead, I'm going to stop my heartbeat for 15 minutes or so, blah, blah, to let, some of those movies that create that. According to some of that research, it might suggest that the brain might actually be able to do some of those things. Now, can the average person, excuse me, I'm going to stop my heart for a few minutes just so it'll last longer in life? Probably not. Now, we could go on and do the test one more time, but the third version of the test looks like this. And we'll maybe just skip that. This version of the test was created by a lady by the name, if any of you educators might remember the name, Madeline Hunter. Madeline Hunter published a book in 1967 called Teach More / Faster. And she got into some of this idea of how can we use the brain. Even back in the 60s, she was working on how does the brain work and learn. So this was her standard test that she gave. And so here are the answers, and blah, blah, blah. We're going to skip that test. So here's what usually happens, though. Most people, according to Madeline Hunter, do this. You remembered the first 3 or 4 digits, and you tend to get the last 2 or 3 digits correct, and you missed everything in the middle. If you did that, you've proven that the test is exactly right. You've proven that what Madeline Hunter had her people do back in the 1960s was exactly right. And there's even people, Ebbinghaus, I believe his name was, in 1890, 1880 something, was doing this kind of research 100 plus years ago. They were doing some of this kind of research. And most people did this. If you look at this graph and say, this is time in a lesson, and this is the amount of information retained, your retention level of information. We know from watching people and quizzing people after a lecture that in the first 5 to 10 minutes of the lecture, people remember upwards of 80 to 90% of what happened. And then as it goes on, we tend to forget, and then we remember the last few minutes. I could say the same thing about sermons at church. Yay, sermon, right? How do think of kids. How do all the adults know the sermon's almost over? It's like magic. Adults know when the sermon's just about to end. It's like, well, they were paying attention, that's why. But part of it is this. We remember what happened the first few minutes, and it just declines and declines and declines, and then it peaks a little bit. So you did the same thing. When you did those number tests, you had the first few numbers, you muddled up the middle, and you tend to get the last couple right.
Who should know this, the preacher or the congregation?
I'll just say all of us. But here's what I tell my students, especially in the modern era of how we schedule classes. If we have an hour-long class and we lecture like this, the kids remember the first 10 minutes and then they're gone. So why don't we put a big break and I'll throw paper at you and force you to bend over and pick it up halfway through class, which forces your brain, okay, sit back down. Now I'm going to refocus. I've just taken my 60-minute class period and broken it into 2 30-minute sections, not 30-second. And now my retention rate, I have 2 peaks of retention and 2 low spots in retention. So I've just increased that. And if you know how some schools are working right now, we have what we call block schedule, where kids are in class for upwards of 90 minutes at a time. And I say anyone who's going to teach a 90-minute class should be teaching 3 lessons at least during that 90 minutes. Here's your 30 minutes, here's your 30 minutes, here's your 30 minutes. Or if it's a math class, think of traditional math class. Welcome to class, get out your homework, let's check it. Now I'm going to lecture to you about 15 minutes on blah, 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 blah. And now you have the rest of the hour to do your homework assignment, 1 through 500 even. And then that's how we normally do it. So why don't we say, let's lecture, do a little bit, let's lecture, do a little bit, let's lecture, do a little bit, and now you have 15 or 20 minutes to do all that homework from those 3 lessons, because we taught 3 lessons in a day, not 1 lesson and lots of free time. So I think there's some merit here. How do we put a break, an intentional break? Let's just, some fun, in the elementary schools, we're calling them a lot of brain breaks. Let's do a brain break. Let's all stand up and do exercises. Yeah, yeah.
program that
Yeah, TVs work that way. Every 15 minutes we put a commercial break in, and we put a cliffhanger right next to it. So I had my dog and we went on a walk, just to get you anticipating about what might happen next. So my dog and I were out jogging yesterday morning. Here's another way we do this. So we take that same giant number that no one could memorize, and this is an official brain term, and we do a fancy brain term called chunking. It's an official brain term. We're going to chunk it because that giant number that we couldn't memorize is nothing more than a phone number. 419, 508, and what's even easier, this is like 4 digits. It's really hard to memorize 2637. It's so much easier to memorize 2637 because that's 2 numbers, 26 and 37. It's not 4 digits. Excelente.
That's exactly what they do.
Yeah.
They chunk it.
We chunk little bits and pieces. Does that bottom sentence make sense to everyone? It should. Grandma is buying a red apple. But there's a typo. Can anyone identify the spelling error? Right. See, I screwed this up a long, long time ago. About 3 or 4 or 5 years ago when I first typed this, you know, the D and the E are next to each other on the computer keyboard. I hit the wrong letter. And then I realized, you know, that's a perfect error. So I've never changed, I've never taken it out of this PowerPoint.
A perfect error.
A perfect error. A perfect error. But see, the brain likes structure. The brain wants structure. The brain will demand structure whenever it can find it. And that's why everyone can read what this says. The apple is red. I mean, it's all screwed up, but we know exactly what it means because the brain looks for it. The brain wants to have stability in it, which is another cool thing about the brain. There it is. The apple is red. Sticking with that order, do you see the pattern here? There is one. Once you see it, it's like obvious, but it's a little more hidden than most people. A lot of college students don't see this one. A lot of people I give this one to don't see it at all.
Thanks for saying that.
Yeah, if you're not seeing it, don't worry. Yeah, I hear someone see it. Yeah. LSD, NBC, TV, FBI, USA. The space is the space is right here. You know, the space should be here. NBC, TV, FBI, USA. Again, if you had time to study it, you'd probably see it eventually that it was there. Again, the brain likes order, the brain wants order, the brain demands that if we don't give order to the brain will find it somehow. I don't know if you remember the movie 9 to 5, but there's the general rule that how much can the brain remember at any given time? The general rule is 7 items plus or minus 2, which is the same as 9 to 5. So, when I used to teach high school Spanish, I'd say, here are your 30 vocab words, quizzes on Friday. I told my students this kind of information. The human brain can only handle memorizing 7 items at a time. So they'd immediately, hey, Kirchner, we can't have this vocabulary list. It's way too long because you already told us that the brain can only remember 7 things at a time. So I would say to my students, so take your list of 30 and divide it into groups of 7. Memorize those 7. When you're done, come back and memorize these 7 and review those 7. Now you have 2 groups to review and a 3rd one to learn. So let's chunk it. Let's learn it in manageable groups. This number is also variable depending on age. As a general rule, like if you submit a small child, hey, small child who's 5, I need you to run to the grocery store and get me eggs, cinnamon, baking powder, baking soda, Coca-Cola, and bread. They're not going to remember those things, plus they can't go to the store by themselves anyway. But the reason you have to make a list is because you cannot remember all those things at one time. And again, 7, the average adult, 7 plus or minus 2 items is how many you can handle at one capacity. So those lists, that's just how it goes. The brain can't handle too much. McPherson High School and the school district started adopting a thing called quantum learning as a teaching tool a few years ago. And quantum learning is simply taking a lot of these brain-based approaches, blending them all together into one package deal. And one of the things they always teach all the new teachers now is this: the great combination to all learning. It's as simple as 10-24-7. So the combination goes like this. If you have something new that you need to remember, you need to review it. To boost retention of what you're learning, you need to review information 10 minutes after you learn it, which would be very intentionally why, after I spoke about for 10 minutes on the biology of the brain, I said, talk amongst yourselves and recap this and share 2 things that you learned with someone else. And then 10 minutes later, we had another break. And I said, tell someone in the room about a memory, that how memories work in your brain. So I've put 2 intentional breaks, approximately 10 minutes apart, because we know if you review things 10 minutes after you learn it, retention goes up. We also know that if you review the same information 24 hours later, you boost retention. But that 24 hours is critical if we go back to the very first slide and we talk about the hippocampus again. It's 24 hours later after 4 solid hours of delta sleep, because you have to clear out the hippocampus or it's still clogged from yesterday's learning. You're not going to be able to put new stuff in it because it's already full. So 24 hours later if you review something new, and then you need to review within 7 days. So 10 minutes, 24 hours, and 7 days is kind of that way. And the general idea would be if you follow this pattern when you're learning new things, retention rate stays fairly high up in the 80 to 90% range. You know, hardly anyone is probably at 100% retention rate all the time. I mean, there's a few outlier people who like, here, read this newspaper. Oh, yeah, page 3, there's a typo. I've already read it. You know, those people who can just like instant memory, they read anything and they have it memorized forever and ever type thing. So. And this chart kind of shows the forgetting curve. If this is the percent of stuff that you remember at 90%, you know, if you ask someone the moment they memorize stuff, the retention's really high. If you go 10 days later, if you've never reviewed it, you know, if you memorize it the first time and you ask someone 10 days later, on average, they're at like 60% retention rate. Go ask an actor who's been in a play. Do you remember all your lines from that play you did 3 years ago? Of course they don't. You know, there might be 1 or 2 exceptions out there, but for the most part, we don't remember stuff unless we review it. But you see that curve doesn't get nearly as dramatic. We're saying at 60 days after you learn something new, retention rate is like 20% if you've never reviewed it. But if you continue to review systematically, you know, we can keep, if we review things systematically and we're like 10 days later we keep reviewing stuff, we can keep our retention rate up there at 90%. But again, we have lives, we have stuff that we're doing, so we don't take time to do all of this. But it's a great tool to remember. So, hey, we've just looked at things like the brain likes order. We talked about retention. We talked about when should we rehearse. We talked about the quantity a brain can remember and how the brain likes order. Take a second and take the quiz. Tell a neighbor something about those things that you remember. One more recap. Share amongst yourselves. I'll get some music going. Thank you for sharing. I've got a whole bunch more that I'm not going to do. So I'm going to stop there unless you have some questions that I can't answer. I'll be happy to entertain the questions. I can't promise I can answer anything.
I think a lot of us are very much concerned about the fact that we can't remember each other's names when we see each other, that we know each other really well. Can you help us with that?
My best suggestion would be this retention idea. I mean, are you doing specific things to practice and rehearse? So, yeah. But I have the same issue with names myself. I mean, yeah.
Well, the amazing thing is, though, that sometimes you can't think of it now, and then a couple hours later, here the first and last name and everything comes through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have that problem all the time. Once a week in class, I have that problem. Hey, I'm glad you're here today. It's nice to see you because I don't know what your name is right now. Doris.
Two things. One, if they call us dense, we should also say thank you.
Yeah. If you're dense.
And the other one is, I think everybody here ought to know one of the things that was said about you last night. He was given a certificate for what, 5 years?
10.
10. So there's my retention. and I think about you, they said, students actually said they wish your classes were longer. I thought that was a fantastic compliment. So congratulations.
Thank you.
No.
Anything else?
Well, I have this question, and you say you haven't dealt with that too much. Kent's brain is gone. He couldn't get down there by himself. But yet he can sing the words to a hymn. He can, without the music, without the words.
Does he still whistle?
And his brain is from way back.
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
It is. It's just an amazing tool. And I've not delved into any of that other side. I've been dealing more with the younger side. So yeah, it is. It's truly fascinating how it works and how it doesn't. So.
Let's express our appreciation to Shane.
Thank you.